what if a single administrative decision on fertilizer exports could shake Europe's entire food supply? Back in March 2006, Russia's Ministry of Agriculture suddenly announced a pause in fertilizer exports until April 21st. The official reason sounded perfectly reasonable. Russian farmers come first, especially right before their own spring sowing. Makes sense, right? Just good stewardship, nothing personal. But there's one detail that takes this from a simple domestic move to a masterclass in geopolitical strategy. See, April 21st isn't just any date. It's the heart of the spring sowing season for Europe too. At that exact moment, every day without fertilizer means lost yields come autumn. It's a surgical strike, timed down to the week, that leaves European farmers on edge and their governments scrambling. Is this just about supporting Russian agriculture, or is Moscow quietly testing how tightly it holds Europe in its grasp? Let's talk numbers. Last year, about 22% of all fertilizers imported by the European Union came from Russia. That's every fifth bag European farmers spread on their fields. And here's what's really alarming. In just the last 4 years, this dependency has gotten even deeper. Instead of shrinking, it's grown by 7 full percentage points. Politicians in Brussels kept promising strategic autonomy. Yet, behind the scenes, ties only tightened. This isn't just about percentages on a chart. Since the crisis began, fertilizer prices in parts of Europe have jumped by 15 to 30%. For a farmer, that's not just a minor cost increase, it's a threat to survival. Fertilizer isn't a luxury, it's the backbone of modern agriculture. Without it, harvests can fall dramatically. And when yields drop, food prices follow. That's not just a problem for farmers, it's a problem for everyone, from bakery owners to families buying groceries. So here's the real risk. If Russia decides to squeeze this lever hard, Europe's food security, economic stability, and even political unity could start to unravel. All from an administrative pause that's anything but simple. But just how deep does this dependency run? And why can't Europe just swap suppliers or ramp up its own production? Let's break down the hidden architecture of this supply chain and see why it's not just about who sells to whom. How much does Europe really rely on Russian fertilizers? The answer might surprise you, and it's not just a statistic, it's a warning. Last year alone, the European Union sourced 22% of all its fertilizer imports directly from Russia. That's nearly a quarter of every bag of fertilizer spread over European fields. But here's what's more alarming. That share jumped by 7% in just 1 year, reaching a staggering 45 million tons. For all the talk in Brussels about strategic autonomy and reducing external vulnerabilities, Europe's dependency on Russian fertilizers hasn't shrunk. It's grown deeper and more entrenched. This isn't just about trade numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the food on Europe's tables, the livelihoods of its farmers, and the stability of its economies. For 4 years, EU policymakers have proclaimed the need for independence from Russian energy and raw materials. But in the case of fertilizers, every policy move, every round of debate, has only led to more reliance, not less. And then came Russia's pause, a strategic move that's as subtle as it is powerful. Unlike the drama of threats or ultimatums, Russia simply said, "We need it for ourselves." End of story. There's no counter-argument, no negotiation table to sit at. When the world's biggest producer quietly turns off the tap, there's nothing Europe can do but watch and wait. It's not blackmail. It's a matter-of-fact assertion of self-interest, and it hits Europe right where it's most vulnerable. Why is this such a big deal? It comes down to Europe's own production limits. Take Germany, for example, home to one of Europe's biggest fertilizer producers, SKW Piesteritz. Not long ago, they had to stop production, not because of sanctions, not because they ran out of raw materials, not even because of broken equipment. The simple reason? It was unprofitable. Making fertilizers in Europe with European gas prices is like heating your house with designer perfume. Technically possible, economically absurd. Right now, SKW Piesteritz is running at full capacity. But don't be fooled. It's not because Europe suddenly has cheap gas, or because of some breakthrough in technology. It's because a global crisis drove fertilizer prices so high that even expensive European production finally became profitable. But as soon as prices stabilize, the old story returns. The factories shut down, and Europe turns back to Russian imports. European fertilizer production isn't a strategic pillar. It's an emergency patch that only works when the world is on fire. The rest of the time, the industry sits idle, waiting for the next catastrophe. This exposes a fundamental dilemma. If Europe can't secure a steady and affordable supply of fertilizer, food prices will climb, supply chains will wobble, and farmers, already stretched thin, could face bankruptcy. It's not just Hungarian officials raising the alarm. Across the bloc, farmers are running out of patience as costs soar and political answers run dry. And despite 4 years of sanctions packages against Russia, Brussels has always carefully avoided touching fertilizer imports. There's a simple reason. Sanctioning Russian fertilizer would be like imposing sanctions on Europe's own food supply, on its own farmers, on its own voters. Even at the height of geopolitical tension, that's a line nobody in the EU is willing to cross. But the true power of Russia's fertilizer grip isn't just in direct exports. It's in the invisible threads of the global supply chain. Even if the EU found political unity, there's no real alternative. When dependency runs this deep, even a temporary pause in supply creates chaos. So, what happened when Russia hit pause? Let's look at how that single move set off a domino effect across European markets. What happens when the dominoes start to fall? The moment Russia hit pause on its fertilizer exports, the tremors shot straight through Europe's food system. Fertilizer prices didn't just blip, they surged by 15 to 30% across the continent, blowing past what anyone would call normal seasonal swings. This wasn't just a market hiccup. It was a wake-up call that fertilizer, so often taken for granted, is the lifeblood of modern agriculture. Without it, crop yields plummet, food supplies shrink, and suddenly, every loaf of bread, every carton of milk, every cut of meat becomes just that much more expensive. For European farmers, this isn't some distant policy debate or geopolitical chess move. It's their daily reality. When fertilizer costs soar, so do their expenses. But here's the catch. Farmers can't simply pass those costs along, not in a world where supermarket shelves are supposed to be groaning with affordable food. So the pain spreads, first to the farmers, then to the distributors, and finally to every household in Europe. But let's dig a little deeper, because the crisis didn't stop at high prices. It turned the spotlight on a harsh truth. Europe's own fertilizer industry isn't built for resilience. Take Germany's SKW Piesteritz, the country's biggest fertilizer producer. Their factory only runs at full tilt when global fertilizer prices hit crisis levels. Why? Because it's powered by natural gas, and in Europe, gas is expensive, painfully so after years of distancing from cheap Russian pipelines. When prices are normal, the factory teeters on the edge of unprofitability. In essence, Europe's fertilizer industry has become like a fire station that only springs into action during a blaze. When things are calm, the lights are dim, the machines idle. Meanwhile, the political heat is rising. As food and fertilizer prices go up, so does the pressure on Brussels. Hungary, for instance, is demanding lower tariffs on Russian fertilizers to protect its own farmers, drawing a line in the sand and exposing cracks in EU unity. Should Brussels listen? If they drop tariffs, Russian fertilizer floods back in, but so does cash into Moscow's war chest. Keep the tariffs, and European farmers are left to fend for themselves against skyrocketing costs. It's a lose-lose situation, with no easy exit. And all the while, food inflation is becoming impossible to ignore. Prices are rising at the checkout, fueling farmer protests and sowing frustration across the continent. In France, Germany, Poland, you can see the anger in the streets and in the fields. Farmers are squeezed by input costs they can't control, competing on a global market suddenly stacked against them. For Europe as a whole, it's about more than just money. Food affordability, the viability of family farms, even political stability itself, All are on the table. But there's a deeper problem here, one that's not just about politics or economics. Europe didn't end up dependent on Russian fertilizer by accident. The entire system is built around cheap, abundant natural gas, the kind Russia and the Persian Gulf have in spades, and Europe, frankly, does not. When Russian gas flowed freely, European fertilizer plants could compete. But after cutting itself off from the Kremlin's pipelines, Europe had to turn to more expensive liquefied natural gas from the US and Qatar. That shift isn't a temporary headache, it's a structural problem, locking Europe into permanently higher costs and eroding its competitiveness, both in fertilizer production and in the food that depends on it. So when Russia paused its exports, Europe wasn't just faced with a shortage. The real crisis was a sudden, brutal exposure of how little backup there is, how fragile the food system becomes when the invisible hand of global supply is suddenly yanked away. And with other major suppliers like those in the Persian Gulf often just as vulnerable to disruption, Europe found itself squeezed from both east and south, with no quick fixes in sight. You can't just build new factories, ports, and supply chains overnight. This is infrastructure laid down over decades. Change takes time, and time is exactly what Europe doesn't have in a rolling crisis. The stakes couldn't be higher. Food inflation is already stoking anger. Protests are growing, and as political leaders scramble for answers, the reality is setting in. Europe's food security is at the mercy of forces far outside Brussels' control. But the crisis doesn't stop at politics and economics. The supply cuts are about to get even worse. What if Europe loses not one, but two lifelines for its fields? Imagine, just as Russia pulls the plug on fertilizer exports, another crisis erupts. Conflict in the Middle East blocks the Hormuz Strait, Europe's main artery for Persian Gulf gas and fertilizer raw materials. Suddenly, two of the world's biggest fertilizer sources, Russia and the Gulf, are cut off at the same time. This isn't just a headache. It's a double supply squeeze that Europe is utterly unprepared for. Because here's the brutal math. Europe's fields are built on nitrogen fertilizers, and those fertilizers are made from hydrogen, which comes from methane, natural gas. Not a minor ingredient, but the fundamental lifeblood of modern agriculture. Russia has plenty of this gas, cheap, reliable, guaranteed for decades. The Gulf states, Qatar, the UAE, Iran, sit on even bigger reserves. They can churn out fertilizers at a price Europe simply can't match. And Europe? Ever since it cut itself off from Russian pipeline gas, prices have soared and never looked back. LNG from the US or Qatar costs a fortune by comparison. That price gap isn't a temporary bump, it's a structural problem. European fertilizer factories can only run at full tilt when global prices spike to crisis levels. Otherwise, with expensive gas, they're barely scraping by or shutting down altogether. It's not politics. It's cold, hard economics. Now picture what happens when, in the same moment, Russian exports vanish and the Hormuz Strait slams shut. Brent crude rockets past $100 a barrel. Energy costs explode. Fertilizer costs follow. European food producers are left scrambling. There's no supermarket for global fertilizer, no quick fix, no one you can call to fill the gap overnight. Supply chains for fertilizer aren't just about buying and selling. They're webs spun over decades, with deeply entrenched roots, contracts, and dependencies. You can't simply reroute ships or swap suppliers in a few weeks. The squeeze gets tighter. From the east, Russia shuts the tap. From the south, the Gulf is locked out. Europe is trapped, its agricultural system hemmed in by two crises at once. Alternative sources? They're either too small, too expensive, or simply unavailable at the necessary scale. And with key Middle Eastern and Russian supplies gone, the rest of the world is scrambling too. Prices spiral for everyone. The risk? Catastrophic spikes in food prices. Farmers bankrupted by soaring input costs. Food security, already fragile, cracks under the pressure. Suddenly, it's not just about groceries getting more expensive. It's about strategic vulnerability on a continental scale. Europe's ability to feed itself, to keep its farms running and its people fed, hangs by a thread woven through Moscow and the Gulf. And here's the kicker. Even if Europe tries to cut Russia out directly, can it really escape this web? That's the next layer of the trap, and it runs much deeper than most realize. Can Europe really block out Russian influence? Or is that just an illusion? Let's pull back the curtain on how Russian fertilizers still find their way onto European plates, even when the doors appear to be closed. Sanctions, tariffs, policy statements, they all make for dramatic headlines. But the real story is happening out of sight, in the tangled web of global food supply chains. Take Brazil, for example. Most Europeans don't give a second thought to the origins of the soy, beef, or coffee they buy in supermarkets. But here's what's rarely discussed. Over 32% of Brazil's fertilizer imports come directly from Russia. Those fertilizers are spread on the vast fields that produce the soybeans, the corn, the sugarcane, the beef pastures. Later, the harvest heads across the Atlantic in shipping containers, labeled "Product of Brazil," and ends up on European tables. So, even if Europe stopped buying Russian fertilizers entirely, it wouldn't actually change the outcome. Russian nutrients, so to speak, would simply arrive in Europe hidden inside Brazilian, Indian, or Moroccan exports. The supply chain becomes less visible, but the dependency remains absolutely real. Every time Europe tries to close one door, Russian influence slips in quietly through another, disguised by a different flag, a different port. This isn't by accident. This is strategy, built up over years, contract by contract, quietly, methodically. Russia has made itself indispensable, not just through direct deals with Europe, but by embedding itself in third-country supply lines that circle the globe. The Kremlin understands the game better than anyone, and they're not shouting about it. They're calmly stating the facts. When Russia's export pause sent fertilizer prices soaring in Europe, it wasn't just an economic shock. It was a reminder of who's holding the cards. Russian officials didn't bluster or threaten. Kirill Dmitriev, a top Kremlin negotiator, simply noted, "Russia is in a favorable position in the forecasted era of extreme deficit." No threats, no boasting, just a statement of reality. And that's what hits hardest, because you can argue with threats, but you can't argue with facts. This marks a fundamental shift. In the past, Moscow's rhetoric was defensive, talking about retaliation, about weathering sanctions. Now, for the first time, we're hearing something different. A calm acknowledgement of advantage. A new normal. Not a passing crisis, but an era that's been years in the making. The stakes for Europe couldn't be higher. Every plan for strategic autonomy or food security now looks more like theater than substance. As long as Russian fertilizers are spread across Brazil's crops, as long as those crops are shipped to Europe, the continent's food system remains structurally tied to Russian resources. It's a dependency that's gone underground, not disappeared. So with the reality exposed and the invisible web tightening, the big question is, what choices does Europe actually have as the dust settles? When one calm, business-like decision can shake a continent, what's really at stake? In the end, Russia didn't need to threaten, posture, or even raise its voice. With a single administrative pause, just a quiet halt to fertilizer exports, Moscow pulled back the curtain on Europe's deepest vulnerability. And what we saw wasn't just a fleeting crisis or a blip in the market. It was a permanent shift in power, one that can't be undone by policy tweaks or wishful thinking. Because Russia's real power isn't just in what it sends directly to Europe. It's in the invisible grip it has on the entire global fertilizer chain. Let's put it all together. The moment Russia stopped exporting ammonium nitrate, European fertilizer prices skyrocketed, somewhere between 15% and 30% in just weeks. Farmers across the continent started calculating their losses, already dreading the ripple effect. Higher costs mean higher food prices for everyone, from Paris to Warsaw. And the political fallout was almost immediate. Hungary called for lowering EU tariffs on Russian fertilizers to help their struggling farmers. But Brussels was paralyzed. Lower tariffs would hand more money to Moscow, but keeping them means squeezing European agriculture even harder. It's a lose-lose scenario, with no easy exit. Meanwhile, alternative supply routes were suddenly cut off. The blockade of the Armenian Straits, instability in the Middle East, and disruptions in the Persian Gulf all collided to close off other options. Two major channels snapped shut at once, leaving Europe even more exposed. Building up Europe's own fertilizer industry has proven all but impossible. Natural gas, the lifeblood of fertilizer production, is simply too expensive in Europe, and local factories can only stay open during times of extreme crisis, shutting down as soon as markets stabilize. There's no robust, affordable domestic alternative waiting in the wings. And even if the EU bans direct imports from Russia, the fertilizer still finds its way onto European fields through third countries. Brazil, for instance, now acts as a backdoor conduit. About a third of Brazil's fertilizer imports are Russian, and Brazilian agricultural exports feed Europe. It's a global game of musical chairs, and Russia always ends up with a seat. This isn't a short-term tactic. Kremlin officials like Kirill Dmitriev aren't talking about riding out the storm. They're calmly stating the obvious. Russia is in the driver's seat, and everyone knows it now. This is not a crisis to be solved. It's a new reality to be lived with. The much-celebrated dream of European strategic autonomy now rings hollow. In the last 4 years, dependency didn't fade. It grew. 45 million tons of fertilizer imports last year, up by 7%. And when Russia finally decided to pull the lever, there was no way out, no direct workaround, no alternative that's viable on price, scale, or timing. Yes, Russia will likely resume fertilizer exports after April 21st, once the sowing season ends and the formal excuse evaporates. In Brussels, there'll be a sigh of relief. Officials will claim it was just a temporary episode, nothing more. But something fundamental has changed, and there's no going back. Now everyone has seen just how easily the entire European food system can be knocked off balance by a single, seemingly routine decision in Moscow. So what's left for Europe? 3 paths, none of them good. Lower tariffs and admit total dependence. Keep buying at sky-high prices and pretend it's all under control. Or go searching for an alternative that, as we've just seen, doesn't really exist. Not on price, not on reliability, not on scale. Which way will Brussels go? Will they quietly give in, or keep pretending there's no problem? Which would you choose if you were in charge? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Because Russia's lever isn't just real, it's already in use, and there's no way to unsee it now.